All right. Hello. So thank you so much for joining us for the Storybrewers Facilitator Q&A. My name is Kimberly. As the community foster for Storybrewers, I will be helping Hayley, our fearless leader and amazing games designer, run this event. I will be asking them the questions that have been submitted about facilitating, and, well, they're going to be answering them because they're a wealth of knowledge. So I'm going to hand over the reins to Hayley to do a bit of introduction about what facilitating is before we get into the questions.
Hello, everyone. I am excited to see so many folks here. And if you're watching this after the fact, I'm still excited. I'm going to talk a little bit about sort of how I see the facilitator and their role in the game quickly. And then we're going to get into the questions that everyone has asked. So if you're here or you're watching this, you probably know that multiple of our games have facilitators. Specifically, Good Society and Fight with Spirit, but our other games can also have some facilitating involved if you're running, for example, a little box game for someone who has never played before. So the things we talk about today will hopefully be useful for all of that. And the way I see the role of the facilitator is really to help people collaborate to tell a story together. Which means they're not in charge of you're not in charge of making up the story, but you're helping the story be told more smoothly. So hopefully we're going to break that down today. So before I talk about what that does mean, I want to cover quickly what helping people collaborate to tell a story does not mean. So here are some facilitator things that sometimes people think that they need to take onto themselves as responsibilities, but that you're really not responsible for. Firstly, you're not responsible for making sure everyone is having fun. Players are responsible for their own fun, just as they are also responsible for bringing their best and collaborating. Secondly, you're not responsible for making sure nothing ever goes wrong. Stuff goes wrong all the time in games, and it's just part of the fun mess of telling a story together. And it's not a big deal. And if that happens, it's not on you as a facilitator, or it's not a problem. And lastly, you're not responsible for having all the answers. Because if you get stuck during a game, you can crowdsource the answers and ask players for help. You can look stuff up. You have all these things available to you, and you don't always have to know all the answers right away, whether that's about a rules question or whether that is about what should happen next in the story or anything along those lines. Okay, so if those things are like too big to be one human's responsibility, what is the role of the facilitator? What does helping people collaborate to tell a story really mean? So the way I see it, facilitator is usually responsible for structure and pacing, encourages players to contribute to the game as appropriate, helps to share the spotlight and balances between these player contributions, and also encourages free and open discussion between players at the right moments. And even for these things, you're not doing them alone, because the players also have a mandate to support the story and contribute to the story as well, and help all these things be realized. But games get a lot easier to play when someone is specifically looking out for these things, right? That idea seems simple in theory, but this Q&A is all about how do you accomplish that stuff? How do you, manage structure and pacing? How do you help people contribute to the story? And so that's what we're going to get into in our Q&A. So thanks for listening to my opening spiel. I'll hand back over to Kimberly for the questions.
All right. So our first question is going to be how do you set a scene? Nice and simple.
Yeah. So broadly, I think that most of the questions that people asked can be sort of divided into questions relating to being responsible for the structure and pacing in game, and questions that are more about player contributions and wishes and managing those. So I think this one falls into being responsible for structure and pacing and how you set a scene. The easiest way to set a scene is it's going to be a little bit different depending on if it's an event chapter or a series of visitations. And I'm going to assume that people want to know not just how to set the scene, but also how to choose the scene to set. If you're starting off a game, I always recommend starting off with an event chapter and kind of more or less alternating it with a series of visitations, unless there's like one particularly climactic reason why you need to stick with one or the other, which does happen. Sometimes you just need so many visitations and you just don't have time for events. It gets real. If you're setting an event, it's useful to think about choosing something that's going to have stakes for the characters. For example, a engagement party where an engagement is being announced. In most games of Good Society, that's going to have stakes for the characters, and so it's going to get messy, which is useful. And in a series of visitations, each player is going to be responsible for, choosing one scene they want to see in the story. So that's pretty helpful. But if people are struggling to think of a scene they want to see, or they choose a scene that is a little bit on the periphery of the story, it can be helpful to ask them about what it is they kind of think their character wants right now, and sort of do a bit of problem solving with them to what kind of scene might help them live that moment in the story. As for setting the actual scene itself, one thing that if you have played with me, you've almost certainly seen me do is outsource that to the players. So usually if it is an event, I will ask people to, I'll first pick on the person who has the most ownership of the event. So if it is your engagement party, your character's engagement party, or it's at your manor, I'll be like, what does this look like? What do we see here? How is this set up? And then I will ask every other person, can you add one detail about this event? And I will also add a detail. And in that way, we can kind of build a cool sort of collaborative idea of what the event is like. For series of visitations, it's a lot simpler. You really only need to know like where you are and one or two details about that situation. Most often people will be in houses. So I'm like, are you in a drawing room? What's the drawing room like? Tell us just one detail about that drawing room. And that can be enough to set a scene like, oh, this is the purple drawing room. And then the whole scene, you're just imagining, purple curtains or whatever it is around the place. And I often jump into, when I'm facilitating, I'll help to set the scene by bringing us to the first moment of the scene. So if it's an event chapter, bringing someone to the first moment of the scene might be like, you're hosting the party, greeting everyone in line as they come in, and the next person to come in is your ex. And you kind of throw people in that way. If it's a series of visitations, people already know what they want to see, so you're just taking to that moment. So you'll be like, the servants let you in, and like you're sitting down, the tea is there, it's cooling, what's the conversation? It can be as simple as that.
And sort of in that vein, how do you choose a scene, especially at the beginning? As you mentioned, event chapters are a good way to get into things. Do you have any tips for choosing scenes based on what the characters are interested in, or things like that?
For an event chapter,
For setting a scene.
Yeah, as I said before, I'd recommend choosing a event that has stakes for the characters. So think about the characters' stories and like the places that are going to add the most tension to those stories, which are quite often private public spaces like parties, because those are the kind of spaces that can be controlled by family. Or maybe if it's a military character, that a open event where people are invited to support the military might bring a lot of tension for the military characters in the game, because they have to deal with hierarchy, but they also have to deal with their private lives. So thinking about like what's going to enhance the tension of the story. If I'm choosing which scene I'm going to pick out for a series of visitations, I'll usually try to look for a gap. There's almost certainly going to be a part of the story that's underserved in the series of visitations when everyone has chosen one. So I will usually, if I'm not playing a character, kind of hang back and see what's missing. Which is there a character that hasn't had as much spotlight? Is there a part of the story that you kind of know needs to move along, but no one's chosen to move it along in this particular series of visitations? And kind of jump in to do that.
Amazing. And then how do you decide when to end a scene, or how to go about doing it?
Yeah, so deciding when to end a scene and how you go about actually ending the scene can take a little bit of getting used to when you're running games. I generally try to, firstly, if a scene is unfolding, it can depend on how much time constraints you have on your game overall. So if you're playing with friends and you're playing like a game that has no specific end date, you can just play until you're satisfied, then as long as people are still interested in the scene, it can be fine to kind of let it go on. But most games that you play will probably have like a set amount of sessions that you're playing to or a set number of cycles, which means that you do kind of need to keep more of an eye on the length of particular scenes. So when I'm thinking about ending a scene, the first thing I'm thinking about is like, what is happening in the scene now? Is drama, is plot still happening? Is story still happening? Or are we vibing? Because like vibing is really fun, but oftentimes in the limited time, you won't have, you want to move the story along if scene is just vibing. So that's the first decision making. I'll usually cut off a scene if it is just vibing gently. If there's still important things to see in the scene, if drama is still happening, then the second sort of thing to think about is like, is the drama going anywhere? Or is it like something really, really important needs to happen in the scene, but it hasn't happened yet? And it's just like, kind of just like building up to it, but not really getting anywhere more towards it. So an example of that might be like, this is the scene where someone has to propose. You know it's that scene because in the series of visitations, they were like, I want the scene where I propose to this character. And you're like, great. But in the actual scene themselves, they're kind of just like talking about the weather. And you're like, oh, I know someone needs to propose here. So in that case, usually what I'll recommend is after a certain period of time, once people have gotten into the scene, if it seems to be stalling because they're not getting to that moment, is I will say something like, often I will offer a resolve token for the thing to happen. So I'll be like, I will give you a resolve token if you propose right now in this moment. And that'll often get us there. If that offering as a resolve token isn't appropriate or it's not going to work for some reason, then you can literally just say, I know that this is the scene that the proposal is going to happen. You quietly, you either in the chat or you sort of unmute in an awkward silence in the scene and you say, I know this is going to be the scene where the proposal is going to happen. What do we need to do to get us there? Like what's your character thinking? How are they, how can we get them to that moment? Is there anything you need to see before then, or is this the moment that they propose? So I find those very helpful for the kind of times when the scene needs to get somewhere, but it's stalling. And then in the last case, sometimes you get a scene where the drama is flowing. It's so tense. Important things are happening. It's great, but it's really, really, really long. And you know that you need to share the spotlight with other characters and their stories. So what I'll usually do in those scenes is I'll put a pin in them and we will come back to them so that other people have a chance to play, and then we'll return to them. And I generally will do this around the 10 to 15 minute mark, depending on the game and how much time we have. Yeah, and that's just a matter of sort of getting a sense of overall how much time you have and how much relative spotlight people have had in the game so far. So, sorry, can I add an extra detail about the actual practical part of cutting off a scene. Generally, if I notice that people are vibing or kind of petering out in a scene, I will start with the stare, which is just I unmute and then I look at them like I'm going to say something and I'll see what happens. And often people will just end the scene themselves if I do that. But you can also unmute and stare for a moment so they can kind of like finish what they're saying and then say, is there anything else that we want to see in this scene? Or do we feel like that's kind of the end there? And people will be like, oh yeah, that's the end. We're just arguing over hats now. Yes, you are just, and then you move it on. So yeah, that's the practical part of that.
It's very fun because I unmuted specifically to say, and Hayley's little thing that they like to say at the end of a vibing scene.
Oh no,
is there anything else we want to see
you saying the thing that I just said.
No, it's fine. We're in sync. So sort of on a similar note, but different, that's sort of managing timing in scenes, but throughout an entire session, how do you manage time? What are your tips on that?
Yeah, so I like to go into a session knowing what is kind of like ahead in that session. And I will say that this is like, it can be kind of difficult if you're, depending on how close you are to the end. If you're close to the end, you'll probably have like a more concrete sense of what you need to get through. If you're kind of still quite far from the end, you might not need to manage time as tightly. But I still find it helpful to kind of have some idea of going in of what I want to get through in a session. So I'll be like, look, and I usually do this by looking at the cycle of play. So I'll be like, okay, here's where we are. Here are the next few phases. Here's what I, in my mind, am thinking that we are likely to accomplish by the end of this session. And just keeping that in mind as sort of a framework for how long-ish things should take. It's good to be a bit flexible on it unless you are getting really close to the end of the game, like the last couple of sessions. But just having that in the back of your mind as a guideline can be really helpful in managing time in the session.
Great, thank you. And then shifting gears a bit, as I am facilitating, how do I encourage players in session to role play? Maybe they are a bit nervous, maybe it's their first time, maybe they're just like, maybe it's a fresh group. There's always different dynamics, but how do I encourage them to role play, and how do I encourage them to contribute to the story?
Great question. And one that definitely is top of mind if you're playing with people who haven't played a lot of collaborative storytelling games before. I will usually start by, if I know that it's folks who haven't played Good Society before, or Fight with Spirit, or haven't played a collaborative role-playing game, I'll usually start by explaining that every player is going to be driving the story in this game. That's not the kind of game where a GM is going to be presenting a story and you're going to be reacting to it. And so that, describing what your character says and does, but also just on the more broad scale, deciding where the story is going to go and what's going to happen in the story is something that we're all going to do in this game together. And that means you and me and everyone. We're all going to do it. So setting expectations is a really helpful way to start. And then generally my number one tip for this is questions. Asking questions is the best. As a facilitator, there is no single one thing that is so helpful as questions. You can use questions for a whole variety of things. Open questions will generally get people out of their shell, get people talking. Leading questions can bring people into the drama or into the moment as well. So all of those can be really helpful. Specifically, if I notice that somebody is struggling to get into the role play, I usually want to use a easy open question followed by a leading question. These might be right next to each other, or depending on what's happening, they might be a while later. So an easy open question is asking them usually to describe how their character is feeling or thinking, or describe the world around them, what the character's wearing, what a place looks like. Doesn't matter. It's basically a fairly straightforward and easy question to answer that gives them the scope to answer it in whatever way that they would like. And this gets people talking, and that's always a positive. And sneakily, that event chapter technique I use to set the scene, that also helps getting people talking and thinking about contributing to the story. A leading question is how you actually get people to start getting involved in the drama itself. And usually to do this, I'm going to ask a contextual question that also invites some action. So depending on what's happening in the story, that might be that two characters are just danced together. One of those characters is this person I'm wanting to bring out of their shell is in love with. And I might say, hey, those two characters just danced together. Kind of looks like they're getting on well, but one of them is a person that you care about a lot. What do you think about this? Is your character going to do anything about it in this moment? And that's kind of like leading them to a kind of action or towards a kind of storyline. If this still doesn't work, then you have hard framing, which is when you don't give people you throw their character straight into a charged scene so that they kind of have to react. And you don't want to do this like before you've given the person time to warm up, which is why we have all those other kinds of questions, especially if they're newer to role playing. It can be a bit intimidating. But if they've had time to warm up and they're trying to get into it, but they're just not sure how to get their character involved in the drama, this is really useful. So the exact situation that I mentioned before, where like you're greeting every person as they come in the door, but bam, face to face with your ex. That's a classic sort of hard framing into a charge situation. And generally, if you can set these between major characters, bonus points.
I didn't realize we were playing for points. Just kidding. It's for resolve tokens, of course. Sort of similar. This is a new question. You talked about the players helping move forward the story, contributing to the story. As a facilitator, how do you basically, big question, how do you create and move forward the plot? Obviously, with collaboration being a very important aspect of the games that you've created.
Yeah, I think it's in a lot of ways it's similar to the last question in that you need to your job isn't to create or move forward the plot so much as it is to help other people create and move forward the plot. But sometimes, so a lot of the time, that is going to mean doing exactly the things that I've sort of talked about. And those are quite useful. So you need to use your story sense a bit to see like, okay, we've come out of backstory, we've come out of the last cycle. Here's where the most tense situations are. And like usually, or like here's where the biggest drama is. And usually it's going to be very obvious to everyone on the table. Like a big fight happened at the end of the last novel chapter. Everyone knows that. And when you kind of have some sense of those, you want to help those come into the story and get resolved. So that's going to be part of what you can think about. And you can bring that in through a series of visitations, through a letter. A letter is often a really good way to bring it in because letters have just like a bit more of a gentle touch. Since you have like a slew of connections, usually there'll be one that can be helpful in bringing that to light. Or, by framing a scene or suggesting a scene in a event chapter is also a good way to do it. That's for society. In Fight with Spirit, things will often come to a head in matches quite naturally. So you kind of have easy mode a little bit in Fight with Spirit for that. But if you're outside a match and something really, really needs to happen, those same kind of ideas. You've got daily life or events to frame those kind of situations. I was going to say, one more thing about it. Was I? No, that was my answer.
Great, beautiful. Thank you so much. And this might tread on the same ground as well, but how do you help players new to Good Society, new to Fight with specifically Good Society, excuse me, moving towards the style of play that Good Society is in terms of, helping them author the story rather than just playing their major character, because that is a pitfall that I think a lot of players fall into.
Yeah, absolutely. So setting expectations, again, as I mentioned earlier, is going to be something that's really important in doing that. Throwing them into scenes is always good, but I think another thing that can help here is to lead by example. So, things like classic facilitator advice for Good Society specifically is like use a resolve token early so that people can see how you use them and what impact they have on the game and how the negotiation process works. And that's going to make people feel more comfortable with using a resolve token later on in the story. Another thing that I will do is kind of like, if you find people are looking to you a lot to be like, oh, what should happen now or what goes next, I will flip that around. I will flip that around on them and I will help them puzzle it out rather than giving them the answer myself. So, people might be like, oh, what's going to happen next in the ball in this moment? Or like, what visitation? I'm not sure what visitation I should have. I don't know what letters I should write. And then you might be like, well, what does your character want to do with this ball? Like, what's on their mind? And get them talking and puzzle it out with them. You might give them some suggestions of things that they could do, and combine those with the information they're giving you to kind of help them settle on what they want to do next. But at the end of the day, they're the one in the driver's seat in that case. So it's generally the best way to do it is just by modeling it and then helping people to achieve it by giving them the support that they need.
Great. And I do think that the answer to this next question, I believe, has been covered, but I do want to ask it for thoroughness' sake. But do you have any additional information or tips for how to help the players along when their scenes are stalling?
Yeah, I think that's something that we did cover, but just to recap the general ideas, it was like the things I said before about like if you know it needs to get somewhere, just using your self token or asking them to get there. And if you don't want the scene to end yet because not enough has happened yet, just jumping with a question that is going to move the scene along a bit.
Oh, and I would also like to add something that I found has been helpful for people who are maybe new to role playing or just aren't feeling particularly creative or in it at the moment, is narrating what the character is doing rather than acting it out. I've noticed that does help some people in scenes where they know they want to get to a specific thing, but they don't necessarily want to play out every single moment of the scene or the conversation, or they're not quite sure where the voice is. So I have noticed that narrating can be useful for the players themselves.
That's absolutely right. And that does come up a lot when it comes to monologues. So monologues can be delivered from like you talking as first person from a character's perspective, but just as often, you can do it as you speaking in the third person about your character and the kinds of things they're thinking about. So you don't have, as much pressure to talk in that character's voice. And so, if you see someone is having trouble starting their monologue in their character's voice, you can offer that option to them. And paraphrasing letters, that's the other one. If people get stuck.
Love with paraphrasing letters.
Yeah. With and people will keep this one forever once they know it's allowed, which it always is. Yeah. Instead of having to write out every word in the letter, if people feel more comfortable just summarizing the content of the letter, you can let people know that that's a thing that they can do as well.
All right. And then how do you balance everyone's wishes while facilitating a game?
That's a really good question. And I think it is one of the most difficult parts of facilitating. I think at the end of the day, it's not your responsibility to balance the wishes as it is to manifest the circumstances where they can bring those wishes out and then let them, take over from there. So when thinking about this, I think the first step is like, you kind of need to know what people's wishes are. It's really helpful as a facilitator to know their like wants for the story. The easiest way to do this, and one that I find really effective, is through an end of session check-in. So I use something called Stars and Wishes, which was invented by Luke Quaid, I believe. And that is basically at the end of each session, I get people to star something that they really enjoyed about the session, which gives me a vibe for like, what's the good stuff? What do we want to see going forward? And also a wish, something that they wish would happen, or wish that we would do better in the future, usually the next session, but also it can just be, overall in the story. And I'll usually make people stick to just one for stars unless it's the final session. But wishes, if people have more than one wish, that's good to know. If you find that people have a lot of wishes and we're getting very close to the end of the game, it can be useful to clarify with people, hey, is this wish something that is a must see for you, or is kind of like a want to have? And that's usually, the want to have, sometimes you can get a suspicion of them because it's like, it's a connection and another connection, so little things like that can help point you in that direction, but there's nothing that beats actually asking people about it. I will also generally do a check-in specifically at the beginning of the final session or at the beginning of the final two sessions if it's like a much longer game, and just make sure I know what people need for their characters to land the plane, so to speak. I don't know who gave me that terminology, but I find it very useful. So what people need to bring the story to a satisfying close for their character. A lot of the time when people think about balancing wishes, it might seem like people's wishes are until you clarify people's wishes, it can seem like they are impossible to all achieve. Once you understand them, it really is just a matter of balancing spotlight. So since we have a little time, I'll talk a little bit about spotlight. So spotlight is sort of the approximate amount of time that is spent, during a game on a particular major character and their story, and you can, literally think about a spotlight shining down on them. And in Good Society or Fight with Spirit, as very collaborative games, this can often be best expressed as how much room the player and their characters take up in the story. And, how I mentioned questions are amazing. You can use them to move the spotlight too. But you can also, so you could, if something's happening and you realize another character hasn't had much spotlight, once that scene ends, you can be like, blah, what are you doing in this event? Or this is happening to you, hard frame the scene, ask them a question, gets them into the moment. But you can also use your connections, you can use resolve tokens, use all the tools and materials you have to help the characters that maybe haven't had as much light shined on them to bring that out too. So to tie that to what I was saying before, often when you are getting towards the end of the game, it becomes a question of just balancing that spotlight between people and just being conscious, like imagine you are holding the thing and you're moving it around, just being conscious of where it's going and how you're moving it. In rare occasions, you will find that people's wishes for the end of the game are actually in conflict. And that is one of the hardest situations to manage as a facilitator, but you can do a lot to help with that. So the main thing here is that you want to have a free and open discussion about it before it happens. You don't want, say there's a love triangle and character A has to pick character B and C. You don't want that to happen in the scene and a character's going to get picked and there was no discussion about it and it just happens in the moment. That can be really challenging for people. I mean, if it does happen, we'll get over it and we'll be fine. But ideally, we don't want that circumstance. So if we see there's a situation, now we know the wishes where the wishes are in conflict, or you just know you're heading into a situation like a love triangle where there's going to be a kind of resolution like that. You want to open up a discussion about it and what's going to happen ahead of time. And, let people say what they want and why they're after that for their character. And if you find that people really can't agree, then you can offer maybe alternatives that you should listen to the heart of what they want, why they want that thing. And then you could possibly offer alternatives or other views that might still meet those needs. And sometimes you can ask oh, if this didn't happen for you, if your character didn't end up with this particular character, but I know that what you said is family is the thing that's really important. Is there another way we could bring that out in the ending? Maybe give some suggestions around that. So basically help to go at the need that character has and explore the alternative views. Generally, that can help a bit. Sometimes decisions like that are just about giving the space for the feelings around them to manifest and for people to talk about it before you actually get into play.
And then as a facilitator who is maybe also playing a major character, how would you recommend going about the balance of player experiences versus what about my own needs and wants for my character?
Yeah, absolutely. So playing a major character as a facilitator is a joy. And I love to do it, and I will do it most of the time. It's in how you balance that with the needs of being a facilitator. It kind of depends on the context going into the game. In most games, I am coming into the game knowing that I'm the facilitator and that my contribution as a facilitator is going to be really important to making, to achieving those aims of structure, pacing, helping everyone collaborate. And so I'm going to be putting the needs of facilitating above my major character. But that doesn't mean that my major character doesn't get to participate and have a great story. It just means that I need to understand strictly where the boundaries of my own major character spotlight are, and make sure they kind of stay in that so that I have enough headspace to also be facilitating. If you're going into a game where you're playing with people you know really well, you played with them stacks of time, and really your job as a facilitator is just to kind of keep an eye on the time and make sure people go on to the next phase and those kind of things. But you're really familiar with the people, then you can kind of relax this a little bit. And even with a group of people you don't know well, you might find that if you're playing a longer game, say you're playing a 6-session game or more than that, in the first couple of sessions, you're kind of having to focus most on the facilitating part. Then you're oh, people are vibing. You can kind of relax a bit more into your character, and then maybe you got to come back as the game is getting towards an end, and the tension is reaching more of a height into taking on that facilitator role. So you got to play it by ear a little bit. If you're new to facilitating, lean towards taking care of the facilitator stuff first. But once you get more used to it, you'll really find that you can balance them quite naturally.
Amazing. And then a new question to noodle on. Not sure if there's an easy answer, but it's a two-parter, and it's, as a people pleaser, do you have any advice in not getting caught up in trying to micromanage everyone having a good time? Yes, you said that it's not our responsibility as a facilitator, but do you have any active in the moment tips? And then I will ask the second part to the question once you've answered a little bit.
I totally get this. I just want to say, I absolutely feel you on this. I mean, beyond just keeping in mind that it is not your job to do that necessarily. You kind of gotta, firstly, you gotta trust the structures and the processes and the things that you are doing, that they are going to help people to have a better time than they would otherwise have. That by being an active facilitator, to the degree that is normal in any game, whether people are having fun or not, that just by doing the things that I've been talking about, people are gonna have you're putting in the right conditions for people to have a good time. And I think beyond that, if you see if you kind of gotta, if you see that somebody is this is a hard one. I'm trying to, because there isn't any easy any answer to it. In some ways, if you don't know the person well and you've asked them how they're doing with stuff, because we've got wishes, we've got all of that, and they're not telling you what they need to have a good time in the game, they're not giving you any clues, then you have to think, I respect that person's right to not have a good time. And that sounds super weird, but sometimes that's kind of just what you have to do. It's totally different if you're playing with a group of your friends and you know each other really well, and you can just be hey dude, what's up, what's going on here. But if it's someone you don't know well, sometimes you just have to respect that and do the best with what you have, and sometimes it does come down to that.
On a somewhat similar note, what do you feel, and I'm sure it varies from case to case, but what do you feel that the facilitator's responsibility is when it comes to conflict between players? Is there, also maybe not an easy answer, but would you have any advice around that?
I think there are sort of two parts to conflict between players. There's conflict between players that's playing itself out right now at your table. People are literally engaging in that behavior. And then there's conflict between players that it's happening not at your table, but you're kind of vaguely aware of that. It is not your job to fix conflicts between players that are not happening at the table. If they're really good friends, you might want to like step in and kind of like get involved in that just because that's what you want to do as a friend. But from a player perspective, if there's conflicts happening and they're not playing themselves at the table, that's not your job. That's too much. You should not need to go there. It is not within the ambit of a facilitator. If people are in conflict at your table and they're really having a go at each other, I would really recommend stopping them. I usually do that. I will usually jump in and say, hang on a minute, guys. Or hang on a minute, folks, as I would usually say. I would usually say something along the lines of, okay, I can see that we really have different views here. What I'm hearing from X person is blah. What I'm hearing from Y person is blah. And like, I think that going forward in the game, and like, if people are in conflict, I usually won't try to ask them to agree on what to do. I will probably make a suggestion that I think is reasonable and see if they will agree to it, because that just makes life easier for everyone. And so I will step in. I don't want to let that conflict play out during the game or at the virtual table. But things that are happening not in the game, they're not a responsibility of the facilitator to fix.
I think it's also probably good to know that if things are getting heated and you're like, hey, like maybe let's take a break, let's take a minute, let's, cool things down a little bit. And then that can also be useful in de-escalating a situation.
Yeah, that's a really great point. If things are getting too tense, taking a break is usually the number one best thing to do if things have reached a point. And especially if you as a facilitator are like, I don't feel comfortable handling this. This is too much. The break is really, really helpful for that. And, that usually just gives everything a chance to just ease off a bit.
And then do you have any advice about, like, let's say you are in a game, it's with new people maybe, or even people that you know, but the vibes aren't right, if you will. Do you have any advice on, like, how to end that game, how to communicate ending a game, like early or prematurely?
Yeah, you're talking about a circumstance where you need to bring the game to an end early because people really just aren't meshing or something isn't working. That's an interesting one. I don't necessarily know that I have a good answer for that. It's not something that I have personally had to do for that reason. But that said, I absolutely think it is a completely valid thing to do. I would think that having an open and honest conversation, that avoids like placing blame, but just being like, hey, I'm getting the feeling that like we're not really having a good time, and that this game isn't really we're not really gonna get anything out of this game. And so, this is what I think we should do, kind of thing might be the way to go about it. But again, unfortunately, I don't have a really good answer there because it's not something I've had a lot of experience with.
Well, thank you for the thoughts anyway. Moving into a different sort of framing, hard pivot to reputation conditions. Do you have any advice on making up a good rep condition when the existing ones don't really fit the situation that's happening in gameplay?
Yeah, so sometimes when you're playing, you will end up in a situation where a character needs to take a reputation condition. And generally for one of two reasons, there is a difficulty in doing this. Sometimes it can be because you are reaching the end of the game. You're very close to the end of the game and you're like, it's really not the time for me to have a massive fight with my family that I spent the whole game reconciling with. I've got one session left, please. And in that case, I will usually just recommend waiving the reputation condition. Just don't worry about it. And just keep following what the story is asking for and what the players are asking for. In the case that you have a lot of game to game and you end up in sort of a weird situation where for some reason neither of the reputation conditions quite work, I would probably just recommend adapting them to fit the bill for you. So, you know, if the game is talking about, if the condition is talking about someone that you met abroad, but as part of your, as a new arrival, but as part of your story, you're actually hiding for that whole time, you didn't meet anyone, then you just think about, okay, well, what's one person I might have met outside the context of this place, because that's what the condition is getting at, and how can I use them in this condition instead? So basically just thinking about how you can shift and adjust it to keep the same general idea, but just change the specifics so that it kind of applies to your character in their situation.
I would say too, if you're looking at the conditions that are available to your character and neither of them really fit, you're like, I can't even adapt these. Take a look at the other like role conditions, because some of those you can adapt to better fit your situation in some instances.
Fracture will work 99.9% of the time.
Hayley
Assuming you're
loves
not in the
Fracture.
I do love Fracture. Assuming you're not like literally in the last kind of couple of sessions, Fracture's it's there for you. It's there for you.
And then, do you have any tips for during character creation? Maybe people are unsure about some of the character details. Maybe one person is has zoomed through, they're reading a book, they're not even here anymore, they're off. Somebody is taking an extra 10 to 20 minutes. Like, do you have any tips for how to keep character creation, sort of collaboration as a whole, more cohesive and working on the timing of that?
Yeah. So generally the way I will try to structure that in terms of the cohesiveness and the timing is that I will try to clearly differentiate between the zones where we're all here, we're all collaborating, and the zones where it's go off and do your own thing. You can still ask questions if you have questions and you need to ask somebody something, but if you're done, you are not required to be completely attentive during this time. And then we come back together, we're all here, we're going to go through some last questions. And I find that works really well. So usually, in collaboration, I try to make sure everyone is pitching in. And if you see someone who hasn't sort of had a view in collaboration for a bit, maybe ask them what their view is on a question. But in backstory, I will usually start by you do desires, relationships. Everyone has to be fairly active during that. And so I will usually we get through that bit where everyone is active, everyone's ready. Then there's a point where naturally people don't have any more questions right now, and they need to just move on to thinking about their characters. I'll usually give people a set period of time for that. If you find that you get to the end of that and 4 out of 5 people aren't ready, then that's fine. You just renew it. Just keep going. If you get to the end of that and one person isn't ready, but 4 people are, then I would generally be let's take a really short amount of time more, max 5 minutes, and just say to that person, think about these things, and then you can fill in the rest between sessions. But preferably earlier, if you notice them getting stuck, you can, if you see that they're getting stuck rather than they're just a person who, just takes time to think about things, which is totally fine. If you see that they're actually stuck, you hopefully want to notice that before. So I will try to keep an eye on how people are going and how people are progressing. And if I see someone has been stuck on connection 1 for 10 minutes, I'm going to be hey, how you doing with that? You need some help thinking of connections? And 9 out of 10 times in that circumstance, they'll be oh yeah, I've got 4 different options and I'm not sure, or as soon as you ask that question, then you start the conversation around it. And then I will bring the conversation back to a collaborative conversation towards the end. So usually I'd ask people to introduce their characters, but I'm going to also be asking further follow-up questions about the relationship between the characters if there's anything that it feels hasn't been properly discussed until this point. But hopefully most things are being discussed in the front end of backstory before you break off. But there's always one or two things. It's always interesting to find out near the end. Oh, one other thing I will add to that. I usually am reading what people are writing pretty actively. And if someone writes something and I'm like, whoa, the other person who's in a relationship with that character needs to know that right now. Not necessarily in a romantic relationship, just has a relationship with them for whatever reason, then I will usually like try to call that out straight away so that both players are aware of it. And like usually it works out well, but it just needs to be something people are mindful of going forward in backstory.
Amazing. And then to wrap up, do you have any final thoughts on facilitating, on running either your, maybe your first Good Society game, maybe your first Fight with Spirit game, or just, running in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think facilitating is definitely something that feels more natural over time. The first time you do it, it does not feel natural. You're like, this is weird. What am I doing? Why am I asking people all these questions? What is happening? Or at least if you're me, that's how I felt at the beginning. And it can be easy to put a lot of pressure on yourself. In some ways, nothing is going to make that. There's always going to be a little bit of stress if you're really new to it, and in some ways just knowing that and like no, hey, you're probably actually like you're helping the group, you're helping everyone have fun even though it feels weird, and it can feel a bit stressful, and in a lot of ways it's just like doing it to then do it is kind of the best way. Like just you can listen to this stuff, but and I think it is helpful. But jumping in and seeing how it is for you and what bits you found easier and what bits you found more difficult, ultimately is the best way. And yeah, and the players are here for you. Like they're on your side. Well, hopefully, but most of the time they are, and that's something that is helpful to remember. And if you get stuck, like I said earlier, like take a breather and let people help you, and that can help a lot.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to everyone who joined us for the Facilitator Q&A. We really appreciate all of your questions and your participation, and we're excited to see you in a game soon.
Thanks, everyone.